I've been on Linux for, I don't know how many years at this point. It's gotta be probably 6, 7, somewhere in that range. There's a video on my channel where I talk about it, and I'm kind of used to how things work now. Like, things don't surprise me. There might be new environments that come out, new pieces of software and things like that, but they all kind of have the same sort of vibe to them. But recently I saw this thread. What is the culture shock of swapping to Linux or switching to Linux? Apparently I can't read. That's nothing new. And I thought it'd be interesting to sort of go over what people who might be newer to Linux feel like is a bit weird when they first swapped. Things which didn't really make much sense to them. And I'm not going to go over everything because there is quite a number of comments here, and a lot of them are repeated, and a lot of them are not really saying anything that makes any sense because Reddit, but I will go over the ones I do think are interesting. The first one right here I think is a great one. Entering a password in the terminal. In Linux, it often is completely blank when you type the password, whereas in Windows, there are generally asterisks for each key press. Don't panic, your keyboard is still working. Now, this is something you can change. There is just a setting to go and do so. You have to know that setting exists, and then you need to have root access to be able to change that setting, so you have to at least do it once. But I remember when the Steam Deck first came out, there was a lot of people very confused by this. A lot of people who had never actually used sudo and just didn't realize it was a thing and thought, oh, I'm typing, but nothing's appearing, therefore it's broken. That has kind of like phased out as there's been a lot of posts about this, a lot of videos about it. I actually made a video on this years back when the Steam Deck came out, but I do think this is something which confuses people the first time they see it. This one might sound dumb initially, but I think it does make sense. In my honest opinion, the biggest shock when using Linux is that it is not Windows. Many people expect Linux to be free Windows, and are confused when they discover that everything is different. Not everything per se, but a lot of things, and a lot of things you are used to are not going to be the same. Linux is very different from Windows, and you will have to relearn many things, just as you learned Windows. That, I think, is a really important point. A lot of people say, oh, I never learned how to use Windows. I just knew. Like, no, you did learn, but you learned it at a time when you were much younger, where you were much more willing to just experiment with the system and not know how to do things. Now you're an adult, you're probably in your mid-20s or your 30s, and learning something new is now something you have to actually put effort into doing. This difference is not a bad thing, but it can be difficult for many people to overcome, especially those who are most experienced with Windows. Same thing with macOS as well. Yes, macOS is more similar to Linux because it is a Unix-like system, but a lot of people using macOS are not using a Unix-like system. They are not interacting with those Unix-like tools. They're interacting with a graphical shell and nothing else. You will need to get used to how logical drives work, because it's not C and D drives like in Windows, but /dev/SDA1, /dev/SDA2, /dev/SDB1, or if you have an NVMe drive, well, the name's going to be even worse, and various other things going to have different drives. And these can be mounted to different directories and have different file systems. This is not a crazy big change, but if you're very used to the whole C, D, E, F, so on and so forth drive structure, I can see that being a little bit strange. Now, there's some other points in here, some of which I don't think are as important, but I do want to mention this one. Customization is on another level. You can change anything in the system, but to be careful, you need to understand your actions, because higher freedom means a higher chance to break the system. You can go and just get rid of everything. You can change out core parts of the system, and nothing is stopping you. Yes, there might be a warning. Yes, it might say, hey, you probably shouldn't do this, but you can just go and do it. And someone else raised a similar point. I think for a lot of people, the ability and extent of customization and modification is a surprise. Just look at any Linux-related sub like Unix porn and see the amount of writing that can be done. On Windows, you usually have to get some third-party app to do things that on Linux DE would be basic configuration, and you'd probably have to make some sketchy registry entry. Now, there actually are custom desktop shells on Windows. no one knows about them because there's very few of them, they're not talked about, and obviously, it's not really the main intention of Windows, so it's not exactly an obvious thing to set up. And speaking of the registry, it seems pretty cryptic in my honest opinion. When you add or change something, do you actually know what you're changing? How do you know what that value represents or even does? There are documentation somewhere, but nowhere near as obvious as what you have on Linux. People who complain about the obscurity of Linux hardly ever mention the registry, which is actually even worse in that regard. In Linux, it's usually just editing a mostly human-readable comp file, which makes sense when you read it, and usually is fairly well documented. There might be documentation in the file, or the documentation for that thing you're configuring is usually pretty well accessible. This one I think a lot of people are going to agree with. When you need an app or driver, you don't go to the web, download a file, and install it. Even if there's a Linux version, you do that as a last resort. The Linux way is installing the software from a repository, and if the software you want is not in the repository, you then add some additional repository that probably has it, whether that be from the AUR or the Ubuntu PPA system, or nowadays you have things like FlatHub, you have Snap, you have other package managers like NixOS or the Nix package manager, you have Homebrew if you want to use Homebrew. Now, there are cases where you do go to a website, say with like a app image, for example, but this is sort of few and far between. Even in the case of app images, there are now repositories of app images. This, I would say, is less of a thing nowadays, now that app stores have become more common. Windows has an app store, obviously the Apple ecosystem has an app store, you have app stores for games, but the idea of most of your software being something you can just write a command for and just download, yes, there's also package managers on Windows, but they're mainly for the developer users. Same thing with the macOS ecosystem. You have to choose your peripherals wisely. Now, most of this, I don't know what they're trying to say. I think it all adds into this initial sentence, but it's written so badly, I don't understand it. But this is true. If you want to be able to customize things like your mouse, like your keyboard, there are specific devices that you can pick which are known to have good support. I go with Logitech stuff because Logitech generally has fairly good support. There are other companies like Razer with good support, there's Corsair as well, and a few others here and there, but it's very hit and miss. And then when you start looking at things like, sim racing wheels, then you start getting into areas like this one. This driver has been upstreamed, but there are other drivers which might better support different direct drive wheelbases, so you've got to be very particular about the ones you want. Now, luckily, the main ones, like the Moser wheels, are well supported, so as long as you just buy a Moser wheel, which frankly, you should just buy a Moser wheel, it's not that big of a deal. In the same vein as this, the real pain accepting that certain software features are unavailable to you, like kernel-level entity games, specialized software like Adobe products, etc. There is a janky workaround using something like Winboat, which is basically just running a Windows Docker container. Also, depending on your setup, some peripherals might not work properly. Another pain point are the typical newbie traps like booting into a black screen because Secure Boot blocked your NVIDIA driver. I don't buy NVIDIA. Yeah, just don't do that. Problem solved. Spelt wrong, but regardless. Tailing window managers, weird at worst. Now I can't live without them. Yeah, we'll wait until you discover scrolling, and then your world's gonna change once again. There are tiling-like systems for Windows because you can do things with auto hotkey, and the same thing over on macOS as well. There's a paper WM version for macOS as well, but these are things that mostly developers use, and you don't really get exposed to them normally. On Linux, though, as soon as you start looking at anyone else's desktop, you're very quickly going to be exposed to them. You might not use them yourself, but it's something you're going to see quite frequently. From my experience and still being something of a new user, I'd say the file system. I was aware there wouldn't be an exact program files or system32 equivalent when switching, but all the different folders definitely makes my head spin sometimes. It's not a crazy system, once you have it explained to you and you understand where files generally go, it makes sense. But it is more to consider than you have on Windows. Also, on Windows, you don't really ever find yourself digging into these areas. Unless there's like something very specific you want to do, you kind of can just ignore it. Whereas on Linux, every time you open a file manager, every time you do something in the terminal, you're gonna know that that's there. And there's oftentimes we will have to go and do something in that area. The biggest shock is the realization that you should have switched years ago. Now, I think it depends on what your goals are, because if you're someone who cares about gaming, I would say probably in the past 4 years. Proton's been around a bit longer, but I would say about the past 4 years, things have been in a really good state. If you swapped, a decade ago and you cared about gaming, your experience would have been terrible then. Extremely low RAM consumption. When I boot into Linux, I still can't believe my OS is using 2.3 gigabytes instead of 6 gigabytes by default. What the hell are you running on Windows? Is that what Windows uses nowadays? Is that all of the AI stuff running in the background? Surely like a stock version of Windows is not that bad. And this is relatively high. You can bring Linux lower. That's the nice thing. With a little bit of education, you know what you can get rid of. You know how you can swap to things that make things lighter. When you go to a search engine, the search problem you're having, the search engine returns a bunch of helpful results. Unlike with Windows, where you get a bunch of spam and useless results, even though Windows is the most popular operating system. The reason why it's like this is a lot of problems on Windows you can't solve. So there's no information to direct you to because you can't fix the problem unless you dive deep into the system, and the number of people diving deep into a Windows system is probably way less than the people diving deep into a Linux system. Along with the fact that documentation on Linux is generally far more readily available. There's usually well laid out wikis that are not just intended for low-level developers. It's something that users are expected to see. One of the biggest culture shocks is how painless system and software updates are. Instead of updates at random times that suddenly slow down or even freeze the system for an unpredictable amount of time and often require a reboot, one gets a fast and painless update at the time suitable for the user. This is really a different experience. And this is the way that Windows used to be. Windows used to allow you to say, I don't want to update right now, I'll deal with it later. Now, if you say, I don't want to update right now, eventually it's going to say, no, you're updating right now, screw you, I don't care. And that's great. That's a great system. That makes people love updates. But on Linux, you can just say, okay, I'm going to update later. Maybe you get a warning, announcement from your desktop, but you don't have to do it. Now, there are systems out there, and there are ways you can customize your system to make it so it automatically updates and automatically does that reboot. But you don't have to. The thing that shocked me was that after replacing hardware, there is nothing or very little to do. There is no cleaning up drivers, etc., or reinstalling. It was almost a habit every time I upgraded hardware, I would reinstall Windows. You might have some problems if you go from an AMD GPU to an NVIDIA GPU or NVIDIA to AMD GPU, probably that way. You probably do want to get rid of those NVIDIA drivers you've installed, but it's a relatively smooth process. And the last thing I want to mention, the freedom to make your own choices and make your own mistakes on your machine, and no one else can do a damn thing about it. It is your computer, it is your hardware, it is your operating system, and you are in control of it. But what about you? What were the biggest culture shocks you had when you first swapped to Linux? What was weird? What didn't you understand? What did you think didn't make sense, but now you kind of like? I'd love to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video, go subscribe as well, and if you really liked the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe to the Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and you know. Money that I don't accept.
something like this.